Good morning. Very nice to see everyone here. We've been really excited. I think I can speak for Ann and I when I say it about having this hearing. I am Deb Miller. I'm serving as the acting chair at the Surface Transportation Board. I think many of you will know my fellow commissioner, Ann Begeman, who's up here with me today. I want to thank all of the panelists who will be participating in this hearing. We really do recognize and realize you have travel issues, the time and energy it takes to get all of your materials prepared can be a very big lift, and we know that and appreciate it. I think we have important policy issues before the board, and the only way we can make really valuable, informed decisions is by hearing what you have to say and having the opportunity to engage. And so we're really pleased to have this chance today. As I'm sure many of you know, being active watchers of issues before the Surface Transportation Board, we're having another hearing in July on the issue of revenue adequacy. I could imagine that when we announce this hearing and the hearing on revenue adequacy, there may have been collective groans that went up from the community. In fact, I think I might have heard a few even sitting in my office. I know in the past there have been times when the board has started proceedings, held hearings, and then our stakeholders, after waiting patiently, saw the board do nothing. I want to assure you that is certainly not our intention today. I certainly view this hearing as a means to an end, and that end would be a resolution of this proceedings. But it's not just this proceeding that the board is likely to be looking at. A number of the proceedings that have been initiated at the board and are currently open, as well as the issues we'll be looking at today, have a lot that is in common, and I think when we want to look at these proceedings, which would include issues like exempt commodities, reciprocal switching, grain rates, and the revenue adequacy issue we'll be exploring in July, that because of the common issues that they share, we want to think about all of these issues together and jointly. And it would be my hope, as many of you may have heard me say, that we can come out of this summer's hearings looking at all of those issues together and come back with a comprehensive package of approaches that will make sense for how the board moves forward in the future on a number of issues. It's too early, of course, to say what the board will do, but what I can tell you is that I've got some ideas. I know our staff has some ideas, and I'm confident that Vice Chairman Begeman has some ideas as well. So we may find that in the next few months we'll be looking at making significant changes to our processes and looking at a lot of board reforms. Perhaps what we'll find is that things are going pretty well based on what we're hearing from our stakeholders and learning through the pleadings you filed and the testimony we'll be hearing, and perhaps all we need to do is make a few tweaks or do nothing. But one way or another, what I want to be sure is that we have a resolution to the issues that are before the board. So my goal today for this hearing, for myself at least, is to become much more knowledgeable on these issues and to have a much better understanding at the end of the day about how our rate processes apply to grain shipments, what those issues are, both from the perspective of those of you who deal in the agricultural industry as well as those of you who are in the railroad industry. In my year at the board, I've had many opportunities to meet and engage with agricultural shippers, and based on those conversations, I certainly understand how important consistent, reliable rail service is at a fair price in order for those businesses to flourish. But it's also important to hear from the railroads and understand the issues from their perspective as well. We all know that there are challenges dealing with the grain markets, and it's not necessarily easy to be the one who is serving those markets either. And certainly since the passage of staggers, when we saw a railroad industry literally on the verge of collapse, growing to one that's strong and healthy today, we're all very vested in ensuring that that continues to be a strong and thriving industry. But still, it's clear from the conversations that we have with grain shippers, from the meetings we have in our offices, from the things that are filed before us, that many grain shippers do not feel they have fully received the benefits of staggers. and have concerns. And so that's why we're here today. I'm curious to hear more, and we'll be listening very attentively. And Vice Chairman Begeman, would you like to make a statement?
Thank you, Deb, and I'll be relatively brief. First, I want to certainly thank the acting chairman for holding this hearing today, and I welcome all of the witnesses who have taken the time and effort to join us today and give us your views on what I consider a really, really important issue. You know, the ag community has had frustrations, I would say deep frustrations, with the agency's rate methodology since they were first created. And despite the efforts that the board has taken to establish a process for small cases as Congress directed, you know, we hear the same message that our methodologies, even the smallest 3B methodology, is simply unusable for a grain shipper. We heard that message yet again during the rate reform rulemaking proceeding from the National Grain and Feed Association and the Alliance for Rail Competition, among others. And I really appreciate that the former chairman, Dan Elliott, who I'm not sure if he's here yet today, I think he was going to join us. Hello, Dan. He agreed that we cannot ignore these, important stakeholders' concerns. We really need to explore what more can the board do to fulfill its statutory obligation. So the whole purpose, at least certainly my purpose, isn't to debate rates. We already know the perspectives. The shippers think rates are high. We'll hear from the industry that they're not too high. But this is about, really, my goal at least is to fulfill the statutory mandate to ensure that there is a process here that every shipper has access to in order to have their rate judged fairly and ideally timely. So again, I also want to really thank the acting chairman for making this issue her very first issue to explore during the hearing process. I think it sends a real good signal to stakeholders. It certainly does to me, and I really look forward to the hearing. And I will probably have a few questions during the hearing, but I guess that's why we're here. And just one more final comment. In preparation for a hearing like this, I think we put a lot of work into it. I know that the board staff puts a lot of work into it. And there are a couple of unsung heroes around this agency, a few that I see in the audience, Mike Smith, Douglas, Frank is back here, who really have such a handle on the ag component of what goes on with rail service. And I just want to, publicly thank you for your service to the board and to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann, and thank you for thinking to call out staff. It certainly is true, getting ready for a hearing like this, as I'm sure in your worlds it's been very hectic. It certainly has been in ours. And I do want to say, Dan Elliott, former chairman here and perhaps soon to be chairman again. Dan, if you could stand up, I'm glad you could be here today. Come on. Thank you for coming. I think it's really great you have time in your schedule to be able to be here. It'll be important to hear the issues. Now, before we get started with the testimony, let me do kind of the standard procedural points so everybody's kind of prepared. I want those who will be testifying to know that we have the lights up here. Your testimony is timed. Everybody's been sort of assigned roughly a time, generally what you requested, and I know it can be very difficult, but we'd like people as best as possible to stay within their time frame. Got a long list of those who will be testifying today. So just so you know, what's going to happen is the yellow light will go on when you have a minute left in your testimony, and when you see the red light, that's going to be a signal to you that your time has expired. We'd ask that you move as quickly as you can to wrap up your testimony, and if not quickly enough, then I'll push the button that sends a mild electrical shock to your seat. No, I'm just kidding. No electrical shocks in the room. But at any rate, we do ask that you be as mindful as you can be in the thick of giving your testimony. So a couple of things. If you're scheduled to speak, please be sure that you've checked in with the clerk who's at the front of the room. I want to remind speakers, as I'm trying to remind myself, to speak clearly into the microphone. Not only does it make a difference in terms of the ability of all of those in the room to hear what you're saying, but we are recording this, and so we want to be sure we capture all of your words because we know how good and interesting they're all going to be. And then for those who are both with us today as well as those who might be watching, we will be placing this hearing on the STB website a few days within the close of this hearing. In the unlikely event that we have a fire alarm or there are other events requiring evacuation, we ask that everybody proceed to these doors in the back of the room and then exit this building through the front doors that you came through. There are specific instructions posted at the back of the room for assembly and notification should we have any issues like that. And of course, as we would often do, we remind everyone, if you haven't already done it, to please turn your cell phone off, which is a good reminder to me because I don't think I have turned my cell phone off yet, so I'll do that here in just a minute. And I want to remind all of the parties we're going to be leaving this proceeding open for 14 days after the conclusion of the hearing. If there are additional pieces of information you didn't have a chance to provide or you realize later you wish you would have, you'll have an opportunity to do that. If you have rebuttal information for things you hear today, you're welcome to provide that as well. And then I want to say one final thing before I turn it over to our first witness. We weren't able to get it all done today, but for those of you who have regularly participated at the board, I want you to know we have some improvements coming that we're very excited about. Hopefully, if nothing goes wrong, the next time you come here for a hearing, there will in fact be Wi-Fi available in this room. We're looking at improving and enlarging our screens. I don't know about you all. I just know when I'm in this room, they are simply not big enough for me to see the materials that's on them. So hopefully, for any of you who are back for our revenue adequacy hearing, you'll see some improvements in the hearing room, and we're very excited about it. Okay, we're going to get started now. I'm very pleased that we have with us today Dr. Richard Schmalensi, who's Dean Emeritus from the MIT Sloan School of Management. He has just completed chairing a policy study for the Transportation Research Board that has to do with the STB, how we regulate in the rail industry. Dr. Schmalensi, please come to the table, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity to testify this morning. I think we will try to set up some slides. I'll be reporting on some of the results, the findings and recommendations of a study that a number of us have just completed for the TRB, an arm of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The study was formally released 12 minutes ago. It's available on the National Academy's website, and there are summary descriptions at the back of the room. This study was, was requested by Congress in 2005, funded in 2013, and completed, as we said just a few minutes ago. We were asked to talk about rate and service trends post-staggers, particularly since 2000, to look at the performance of the regulatory regime and to make recommendations for the future role of STB. I'm going to focus on the last of these, just in the interest of being relevant to this hearing. The study process is familiar to those who follow TRB studies. We were briefed by lots of people. We reviewed the literature. We did an unusual amount for one of these committees of statistical analysis of the waybill data, the carload waybill sample, and other data. And of course, we deliberated. One of the key findings, as I said, we were asked to talk about events post-staggers. And I guess I would summarize our findings in that respect by saying that this is just not the same industry in almost any respect that confronted the authors of staggers. It was being bailed out. It was financially shaky. I think many observers, particularly many economists, thought that when regulation was relaxed, prices would of course rise. since you had financially distressed firms. In fact, as everyone knows, prices fell dramatically, particularly over the 2 decades after Staggers, because ICC regulation had restricted the industry's ability to innovate, it's restricted its ability to consolidate traffic, to negotiate contracts, to match up with shipper needs, and on and on. So the industry became much more efficient. While rates have risen recently, they're still below the levels of the 1980s. This slide mentions one change post-2000 that I want to emphasize as particularly relevant to today's hearing. The use of contract carriage of non-exempt commodities has risen sharply since the year 2000. 2012 was the latest year for which we have data. And a lot of that has to do with coal. If you look at on the left, that pie chart shows that in 2000, coal accounted for just about half of the ton miles moving under tariff. By 2012, coal's use of ton miles of coal under tariff went from about half of all coal ton miles to just about 5%. So coal traffic shifted rather dramatically over this relatively short period from tariff to contract. That did not happen for what we have there is the total of grain, oilseeds, and food and kindred. It didn't happen. It's about 70% of that traffic by ton miles moved under tariff in 2000, moved under tariff in 2012. Thus, this hearing is particularly relevant because when one considers the reasonability of tariff rates, one is increasingly considering the reasonability of rates charged to grain, oilseeds, and shippers of food. So I want to focus on the rate relief process and our findings and recommendations with the background that we're not thinking much about coal anymore. Really, we are thinking about the particular characteristics of these other shippers, grain, oilseeds, and food. The current process, as I think everyone in this room knows, has 3 steps. There is the initial screen based on the relationship of the rate charged, the tariff rate posted, to variable cost as determined by the Uniform Rail Costing System, universally referred to as IRCS. If a rate exceeds that 180% threshold, the next step in the process is an inquiry about whether the market involved is dominated by the carrier at issue. Assuming that hurdle is cleared, there then becomes an inquiry into the reasonableness of the rate using either the standalone cost process, the first process devised, or the simplified SAC or the 3 benchmark process. It's important here to note that our committee, as I think most people, retain the objectives of Staggers, which is to have an industry with adequate revenue. That is to say, not to treat it as a public utility, but to treat it as an industry governed by the marketplace, but also to make sure that we respect the Staggers goal of protecting shippers against unreasonable rates, particularly in settings where those rates are driven by market dominance. So our first finding relates to this first step in the process, the 180% of variable cost test. If you read our report, this is perhaps the point on which the committee felt most strongly that the IRCS system attempts to estimate something that is not defined as a matter of economics and thus produces inevitably estimates that are arbitrary and unreliable. Costs are omitted. Railroads point out that the cost of bearing the risk of shipping hazardous chemicals don't show up on their income statements and thus don't show up in IRCs, and it's not a surprise that that most hazardous chemicals move at rates above 180, many move at rates above 180% of IRCs. Determining what's fixed and what's variable and what fraction of a locomotive is variable and what fraction is fixed is essentially arbitrary. Allocating common costs among the traffic involved is inherently arbitrary, and we have plenty of examples of that. There are odd features that go beyond arbitrariness, as that second set of bullets indicates. Some kinds of traffic, particularly short-haul traffic, have rates systematically above this threshold, above 180% of IRC's variable cost. And 20 to 25% of traffic, year in and year out, moves at rates that the system says are below variable cost. And that, of course, doesn't make any sense. That's, if you take it literally, that means that railroads are moving 20 to 25% of their traffic at an out-of-pocket loss. The key point that we would stress is this can't be fixed, in the sense that you can't reform the procedure of deciding what's fixed and what is variable and allocating costs among elements of traffic without producing an arbitrary outcome. Now, to step back, it's not hard to see why when Staggers was passed, the authors wanted some threshold to determine the eligibility of shippers to challenge rates, and this was some, you could do it. And if I were sitting in 1980, it's not clear I would have done anything different. But it's not 1980. We now have plenty of rates that are determined under competitive conditions. And those rates, we submit, can be used as a benchmark. And those rates, as a benchmark, make more economic sense than essentially arbitrary estimates of variable cost. And I will come back in a moment to how we might do that. The second finding relates to the second step in the current process, and that is the market dominance hearing, or the market dominance assessment. Now, we understand why the board has excluded evidence on product and geographic substitutability. That's complicated evidence. But of course, excluding a category of evidence that suggests market dominance is not present is clearly going to bias decisions, just as an economic or a logical matter. That evidence can be difficult to process, of course, but I've done a fair amount of antitrust work over the years, and one observes the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission dealing with evidence of that complexity routinely and simply in informal proceedings. In quasi-judicial or judicial proceedings, of course, evidence of this complexity is hard to deal with. In informal proceedings, not that difficult. Time limits, we suggest, ought to replace exclusion of categories of evidence. Went past one. All right, I need to go back. Excuse me. Yeah. Manual intervention. The third step in the process is either the standalone cost system or a standalone cost test or one of the simplified procedures introduced later. Our committee found that those should be replaced. It's important to understand that given the Staggers Act's enabling of shipper-specific contracts, railroads and shippers have every incentive to move all traffic that can be profitably moved. so that you don't have here the sort of classic monopoly loss problem that you have in regulating electric power or telephone, that, gee, if the price is too high, there will be too little volume. There's not that loss problem. The regulatory issue here seemed to us to be inherently about fairness. And the standalone cost test embodies one notion of fairness, that if I'm paying more than the standalone cost, then I'm subsidizing somebody else under public utility regulation. The standalone cost test comes out of public utility regulation, comes out of telecom debates, in fact, in the 70s, and comes out of a concern that prices too high encourage inefficient entry. Not, as we understand it, a live issue in rail today. It seemed to us that the simplified procedure, and the fact, which this slide doesn't state, but everyone knows, or it sort of does, that the SAC procedure has really not been usable by small shippers, particularly by grain shippers that ship to multiple destinations. Maybe one reason why there's less contracting for those shippers, but in any case, the SAC procedure at, we were told, about $5 million a case is not usable by small shippers. The simplified procedures are simpler, but they make use of IRCs. And if that's fundamentally flawed, simplifying by making more use of a fundamentally flawed measuring stick is not, we submit, a move in the right direction. So let me say what we suggest be done instead. And I will preface this by saying almost everything I'm about to describe almost certainly requires legislative change, which is good news or bad news depending on your point of view, but our task was not to think about what's feasible, but to think about what should be done. So we propose using the competitively determined rates that I mentioned a few moments ago as benchmarks. The report describes how we do that, but the fundamental notion, again, is a fairness notion, that it ought to be the case that a shipper in a market dominated by a single railroad shouldn't have to pay a rate that is too far out of line with rates paid by shippers in competitive markets for similar shipments. So we can look at, statistically, we can model the determination of rates in competitive markets as a function of shipment characteristics. We can then ask, what does that model predict for rates in non-competitive markets? And what that graph shows for farm products, as it happens, given our data, the ratios of actual rates in non-competitive markets to predicted rates in those markets, predicted on the basis of a model of competitively determined rates. Now, you will see that a reasonable fraction of the predicted rates are less than the actual rates, are less than the predicted rates. Those are the rates represented by the mass to the left of the vertical line at 1. And that's, of course, because it's a model and doesn't fit data precisely, and we aren't able to precisely predict all competitive rates. That's a worthwhile caution because it says that many of the observations to the right of that line, where the actual rate exceeds the rate predicted under competition, are there simply because the model is, like all models, imperfect. So we wouldn't propose that all of the rates to the right, all of the tariff rates to the right, be treated as subject to detailed examination. That is to say, treated as if they had passed the IRCs test, the 180% test. But the farther out you go, the more likely it is that what's happening is serious use of market power to raise rates. So Our suggestion is this sort of modeling can be perfected. Our report contains what we consider to be a proof of concept using waybill data and other data that are readily accessible and a lot of work. Two of the members of our committee produced a model of competitive rate setting, applied it to non-competitive markets, and such a model can be tested, can be refined, can be debated. But those are technical questions. The policy question is, what replaces 180? Because 180 is an arbitrary number. There's no economics to it. I assume it was a late-night negotiation. To use this approach, one needs to come up with a replacement number to say that rates that are twice the competitive or 3 times the competitive prediction or 1.5 times the competitive prediction or 180% of the competitive prediction, if you like that, are subject to challenge. This approach, so a few points about it. We advocate this to replace the Erks test. And this could not have been done when Staggers was written. There weren't rates that you would say are determined under competition in an efficient rail system. We have such rates now. The threshold, what replaces 180? It's a policy decision. If you set it too low, you place revenue adequacy at risk. If you set it too high, you risk not granting rate relief to people who ought to get it. There is no magic number. It's likely to be controversial, but like the determination of 180, it can be transparent. Appendix B of our report, thanks to a lot of work by 2 members of our committee, has detailed analysis and a proof of concept. It is not the last word, but it suggests you can do this credibly, and we think it's much better than SAC. For the second and third stages, the dominance test, the dominance proceeding before the STB, and the standalone cost test for reasonability, if dominance is cleared, we propose, again, in the interest of reducing cost and proceeding expeditiously and not excluding relevant evidence, we propose moving to arbitration at that point. If the screening tool is appropriate, one doesn't have to rely on stringency at the second and third stages to preserve revenue adequacy. Arbitration can be informal. We propose it to be behind closed doors with confidential results, so we don't set precedent. It can be fast, it can be economical, it can consider complex evidence. We propose this be final offer arbitration, baseball-style arbitration, because experience has shown that promotes settlement because of uncertainty about the arbitrator's decision. It also promotes the parties making reasonable offers because unreasonable offers are unlikely to be accepted. Now, one reason why we have some confidence in the merits of this recommendation is the Canadian experience. Now, this is not to say the Canadian experience is a panacea or we should imitate all aspects of the Canadian experience. But in Canada, a shipper doesn't have to pass any sort of screen to be entitled to arbitration. A shipper can raise its hand, get rate arbitration, get service arbitration even. The Canadian system, as nearly as we can tell, has not involved a lot of cases, even without a screen for eligibility. Most of those have settled. And while nobody likes to be at the mercy of an arbitrator, the system proceeds without $5 million a case costs, and it proceeds in a manner that makes it accessible to small shippers. And it proceeds without the need to exclude evidence in order to move on a timely fashion. So we think dominance does need to be part of the arbitrator's task, but there's no reason why an arbitrator can't, like the Antitrust Division does, consider complex evidence with a time limit. We also think there is no reason why the kind of cost evidence that would undoubtedly be brought forward in this sort of arbitration can't be considered. Again, the Canadian experience, while not perfection and not necessarily something we want to imitate in detail, suggests that this approach is workable and can be done in a timely, expeditious, relatively inexpensive fashion. I would mention, since I still have a green light, two other aspects of our proposals, and then of course I would welcome your questions. I know you have before you a proposal by Nitley regarding reciprocal switching, and we discussed reciprocal switching in our deliberations. We did not take a position on the Nitley proposal. We did observe that Canada has reciprocal switching everywhere if you're within 20 miles of a switch point, 20 kilometers, I'm sorry. But we didn't reach a conclusion on that proposal or proposals like it, but it did seem to us, it did seem to us that in the context of arbitration, that it would not be unreasonable to allow either side to propose reciprocal switching as part of its final offer. A railroad might say, well, we think our rate is terrific, but if you really think it isn't, we will allow for switching at a certain price and let you negotiate with the other railroad at the switch point. Or the shipper might say, I don't want to rely on you at all, I want switching and I'm willing to pay X for it. We think that if you get to arbitration, it's not unreasonable to have that be part of either party's final offer. With elimination of the IRCS test, there's no longer a concern that this might lead to a rate below 180% of variable cost. Again, putting it into arbitration and not a blanket nationwide policy removes concerns about fee schedules, distances, and so forth. That would be part of the arbitration. The second point up there that is relevant here, of course it's more relevant to your next hearing, but I'm here today, and if you will permit me a few moments to just round this out, we recommend eliminating the annual revenue adequacy determinations. This described by the board itself as a mechanical process, pass-fail grading. Our reason is twofold. First, the prolonged use of this process that looks on its surface like public utility regulation, we compare the cost of capital, do you earn the cost of capital, suggests to some on both sides of the debate that perhaps there ought to be a cap of some sort based on this kind of comparison of returns with cost of capital. We think that's inconsistent with staggers, we think it's impractical, and we think it's not the way forward. The second reason is there's good reason why the railroad industry needs to be looked at closely in terms of revenue adequacy, in terms of competitive conditions, in terms of exercise of market power. The annual revenue adequacy determination is not such a look. So our recommendation is that the annual exercise be dropped, but that the board be tasked with periodically, let's say every 5 years, issuing an in-depth report on competitive conditions, revenue adequacy, long-term prospects, and so forth, to assess whether the policy we have is producing the results that we want, which I don't think, and we don't think, the annual revenue adequacy determinations do. With that, I will pause and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Schmalensi. I suspect there are lots of people in the audience right now that wish they had the opportunity to ask you questions, and if we could do that, we could probably just spend the rest of the day peppering you, but fortunately for Ann and I, we get the opportunity to ask some questions. And I would say to those of you who are in the room, we did have the opportunity yesterday. Dr. Schmalensi was kind enough to come up and give us a preview of the report. So we have had an opportunity to already ask a few questions, but I certainly find that I come up with other questions every time I hear you go through this analysis. And so just a couple of things I want to clarify. You've talked about the issue of market dominance, not restricting categorical evidence, but using time limits, and that works better in an informal proceeding. And when you talk about informal proceeding, is that another way to say arbitration? Is that really what that means?
That's what that means in this context, yes, ma'am.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure that there weren't other ways you all were thinking about it. And one of the other things that I was wondering, when you talk about SAC, and you say, really the purpose was is really more to determine fairness than to efficiency, is one of the reasons why the committee concluded that there's no economic justification for the use of SAC, because the analysis is a fairness analysis, not an efficiency analysis. I mean, am I drawing too many connections from what you said?
Well, it's my lack of clarity, I'm afraid. I think the approach we take is fundamentally a fairness approach, as is the SAC approach. So that's not, if you could do SAC inexpensively and quickly, and it could be made accessible to small shippers, you could argue, well, okay, this is one definition of fairness. The comparison with competitive rates that we propose is another. Ours is very quick, however, and the arbitration is very quick, and an arbitrator will naturally be concerned with issues of fairness. The Sac Test is a particular measure of fairness. We could have a long discussion about its properties. It's not obviously the right one here. I can see why it was done when after Staggers was passed. When confronted with a railroad industry that the costs are too high because of the legacy of regulation, then to say, well, let's look at the costs of an efficient alternative that just serves you, and fairness says you shouldn't be subsidizing other people. Of course, without a rate of return constraint, it's not clear there's a subsidy, but you shouldn't be paying more than the standalone cost of an efficient system. That makes a certain amount of sense, but there's no theorem that says that that's the way to do fairness. I could see why it happened when Staggers was passed. I think experience has shown that it's unwieldy and not the only way to think about fairness.
Certainly it is unwieldy, no question about that. I have a final question, then I'll turn it over to the Vice Chairman. But I want to go back in terms of the issue of revenue adequacy. Again, this is, maybe my interpretation of what you said. And that is that really where we are 35 years post-Staggers is that there's no real purpose served by the revenue adequacy test, and the approach that's been suggested by your committee of doing more of a 5-year in-depth analysis, as much as anything, is a way to continue to monitor, whether or not we're continuing to see a good competitive market, but not really because revenue adequacy is needed in the regulatory process. I mean, again, am I going too far in interpreting the panel's recommendations?
No, I don't think you're going too far. I think the notion that the board should revise its process if the industry is found to be revenue adequate, which kind of lurks from earlier statements, I think is too mechanical in a way. Nobody looks at, is General Electric revenue adequate this year? You look at businesses over the business cycle, you look at long-term prospects, you look at a variety of things in judging the health of an institution. Now, we were not, or an industry, we were not tasked with assessing the methods used in the annual review. We did have discussions about them, but at the end of the day, it seemed to us that what's happened after Staggers, 35 years after Staggers, as the industry has invested and innovated and reinvented itself, is it looks a lot more like a normal industry than it did with Staggers, when Staggers was passed. You could see why you'd want annual revenue adequacy determinations, because are we going to have to bail them out again was clearly on people's minds, and logically on people's minds, given how much had been spent. That's not on anybody's mind today, as far as I can tell. The industry is making substantial investments. The industry is, expanding capacity. So the notion of, do they have what they need to live, and if they do, maybe we should tighten regulation, seems counter to the thrust of Staggers at the end of the day. I mean, Staggers was about making this into an ordinary, healthy, maybe wholesome or not, healthy industry, healthy industry, we can debate wholesome if you like, but healthy industry that, still needs regulatory oversight because it has inevitably a fair amount of market power and is an important industry. But Staggers pointed toward light-handed regulation, not public utility style regulation. And the annual revenue adequacy looked to us a lot like public utility regulation. And a periodic, say, 5-year examination of the industry looked a lot like, let's inform policy and see if we're in the right direction and do we need to make changes. It just seemed to serve, that seemed to be the right purpose today. Are we on the right track? Not turn the crank, yes, no, revenue adequate, not revenue adequate. No.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman Fagan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you have a lot of people needing some air in the room. And thank you really for getting us sort of out of the groupthink mentality that a lot of times we get sucked into when we start dealing with these issues and rate case methodologies and the way it's always been done. You certainly have made clear that much of what you're suggesting is not in our power to do without legislation. But one of the questions I wanted to ask is you mentioned that because of the change in coal shipments, that you sort of did not include that element in your process as far as what you were developing. But even if you had, would you have come out with a different outcome?
No, we would not. I wouldn't say that we excluded them. It was just that we noticed that, almost all coal now travels under contract. My sense is, and I think the sense of the committee, without being able to document it, is that a couple of reasons why contracting in coal is easier than contracting in grain, but an important reason we suspect is that there were all those coal cases, which sort of set bounds on what kind of rates might stand up. That makes negotiation a little easier. We didn't exclude coal from our consideration. The approach we propose would apply as well to coal as to anything else. But coal shippers appear willing to enter into contracts and thus not be eligible for reasonability determination.
All right, thank you for correcting my impression, because I thought you said that you weren't thinking about coal anymore. That didn't, but it had a different meaning.
No, ma'am. It was just to point out that the composition of tariff traffic has changed, but what we propose would apply to all tariff traffic.
On the modeling that you had on the screen for the farm commodities of the different pyramid, if you will.
Right.
Was that just illustrative, or was it actually based on the Waybill data?
Oh, it was based on the Waybill data. It was based on the Waybill data plus data on, I don't remember the name of the database, but it had to do with, provided locational information so that we could assess, is there barge competition nearby, and so forth. It was based on the real Waybill data.
So it was where the traffic was, what was moving, if there was competition, what the distance was.
Yeah, we started with contract or exempt traffic where there was rail competition nearby or barge competition nearby. We treated those as competitive benchmark rates, modeled how they depended on shipment characteristics such as distance, number of carloads, and so on and so forth, and then used that model to say, well, if this other shipment, this tariff shipment without rail competition available, what would that rate have been if it had been competitive in line with these other competitive rates? And of course, the model's not perfect, can't be perfect, so there's modeling error. But as opposed to IRCs, we're at least trying to predict something real, that is to say the competitive rate, not something imaginary like variable cost. So that was based on a rather extensive analysis of the waybill data done by 2 members of our committee with staff help. Again, we don't, let me be clear, we don't say take Appendix B, write it into the legislation, and use it. The point of Appendix B, which is where the analysis is done, is to say this approach is feasible. It can undoubtedly be done better than we did it, but it's feasible.
And as far as sort of the punchline of arbitration, did you have opinions on whether or not it's something that could be done within the board, or actually it should be outside of the board?
We resisted the usual academic temptation to reorganize the federal government. My understanding is that, again, I'm not a lawyer, nobody involved is, but that it would be...
That's okay, neither are we.
I'm not sure the
board... It's
a
feature, not a flaw.
I'm not sure the board has the authority to hand off decision-making to an arbitrator. If it did, then it could. If it doesn't, then it can't.
But if the parties would agree to it, they could.
Oh, if the parties would agree to it, then perhaps it can. Mm-hmm. We don't propose mutual agreement to be the test. Mm-hmm. We've just proposed that to be what you do at that point. In part, that, based on prior cases, would save an enormous amount of person hours at the board to be able to do that.
Well, I guess we're sort of kind of left with trying to fix the unfixable, at least with this proceeding. Thank you for that. But if you have any ideas on what we could do just with our we have a mandate, we have an obligation.
You do, and it is a difficult one, and it's a little bit of an unwieldy mandate, which was part of the point that we tried to make. And I wish we'd been able to come up with, given your statutory authority, here is the obvious way forward, but we didn't impose that constraint on ourselves, and I don't want to make something up here as I sit here. But
well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate your being here today.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, so we're going to move to panel 2 and ask that those who are on panel 2 come forward, which includes Deputy Undersecretary Gary Underwood, and from the Montana Department of Agriculture, Benjamin Tiller, and Mike O'Hara from the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee, I think. And for those of you in the audience who might need to do some planning or thinking, we'll continue to monitor time and make sure it still seems sensible, but we believe we will likely take a break for lunch after panel 3 and before panel 4. Okay, thank you. It looks like we're ready to begin. So, Deputy Undersecretary Woodward, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairman, Madam Vice Chairman. I'm going to start out this morning doing something that I was told I should never do at the beginning of a meeting and apologize. Woke up this morning and realized that my allergies had given me a swift kick in the pants, and so my throat's a little scratchy and my voice is coming and going, but I will do my best to project as well as I can this morning so that you all and the folks at home can hear me. Again, Gary Woodward, I'm Deputy Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs at the United States Department of Agriculture. It's a mission area at USDA that encompasses the Agricultural Marketing Service, which has as part of their mandate the task of monitoring U.S. transportation systems as they relate to agriculture. I'll join the chairman and the vice chairman this morning in pointing out the good work of staff, and I want to thank Arthur Neal and his team at AMS who are sitting behind me for their yeoman's work in this area. They're the real policy experts on these issues, and so I want to thank them and highlight their work on behalf of U.S. agriculture. The U.S. Department of Agriculture does appreciate the opportunity to present testimony at this hearing, and sincerely thanks the Surface Transportation Board for investigating ways in which rail rate challenge procedures can be made more accessible for grain and oilseed shippers. USDA believes that it is critical for these procedures to provide effective protection against unreasonable freight rail transportation rates where there is an absence of effective competition. For too long, most agricultural producers and shippers have been left with no practically accessible means to challenge rail rates, much less seek redress. It is telling that no grain or oilseed shipper has filed a rail rate challenge using any of the board's processes since the McCarty Farms case was decided in 1997. This is not because there have been no complaints about rates. Instead, USDA believes that there have been no rate challenges, mainly because the board's procedures are too lengthy and expensive for virtually all agricultural shippers. The cost of bringing a challenge is only part of the issue. Equally important, but not as easily quantified, is the constant changing of rules and procedures within the current rate challenge system. This makes the outcome of any rate challenge very difficult to predict and undermines the shipper's willingness to take part in such a system. Any newly proposed processes or amendments to existing rate challenge procedures are likely to be met with skepticism by agricultural shippers if they believe the new process will not be consistently applied and therefore subject to unattainable preconditions. A consistent process also establishes credibility. Not only will it encourage greater shipper participation, but it will also lessen the need for litigation and or rate challenges by shippers as time goes on. In the opening comments of this proceeding submitted last year, some rail carriers argued that the possibility of litigation before the Surface Transportation Board served to prevent rate increases in areas where competition is not as strong. Litigation only serves as an effective check, however, if STB's processes are consistently applied. This also underscores the importance of designing an effective and accessible rail rate challenge procedure for grain shippers and producers in order to ensure its credibility as a check against unreasonable rail rate increases. USDA believes that effective regulatory mechanisms are critical to rounding out the rail transportation policy's complementary directive of allowing competition to establish reasonable rates. Therefore, USDA encourages the board to purposefully seek simplicity, practicality, and consistency in developing alternative rate relief methodologies for agricultural shippers and their unique needs. USDA believes that the most promising ways for the board to encourage greater use by agricultural shippers of a specific rate challenge procedure are through 1, significantly lowering the costs associated with the procedure, and 2, demonstrating a commitment to a predictable set of outcomes through the development of a process that is simple to use and easy to understand. USDA believes a formula-based procedure using data that is easy to obtain and deterministic in nature would have wide appeal to agricultural shippers. 2 such procedures have been submitted for the board's examination in the course of this sitting: the Ag Commodity Maximum Rate Methodology proposed by the National Grain and Feed Association and the 2 benchmark tests proposed by the Alliance for Rail Competition. Both of these alternative methods adhere to the criteria of simplicity, practicality, and consistency. Additionally, their inclusion and treatment of railroad revenue adequacy make them strong candidates for challenging rail rates moving forward as the regulatory environment increasingly incorporates this concept. To complement formal processes, USDA has also encouraged mediation and arbitration in its opening and reply comments. A major benefit of mediation and arbitration is that they have the potential to offer rail rate challenge procedures that are less time-consuming and lower cost than formal board processes. In addition, these informal processes foster direct business discussions, facilitating informal resolution of many issues before they require formal procedure. If broadly utilized by the nation's shippers and railroads, mediation and arbitration systems could offer agricultural shippers greater access to rate dispute settlement mechanisms that have a reputation for being fair, easily understood, accessible, and affordable. Examples of these types of arbitration systems that already exist include the National Grain and Feed Association's rail arbitration system and the Montana Bnsf mediation arbitration system. These systems have not been broadly used for rate disputes because railroads have generally been unwilling to arbitrate rates. In addition, the scope of these systems cannot handle all agricultural rate disputes because of limitations on shipper membership, geographic application, and commodity. Nevertheless, they serve as good examples of how such systems can effectively resolve disputes and foster good business relationships. As a practical way to advance fairness for agricultural rate disputes, USDA believes that the board should actively assist in facilitating the expansion and creation of a mediation and arbitration system. Such a system could be the most promising and viable procedure for the average agricultural shipper who may not have the disposition, inclination, or time and money for a formal process. At the same time, the use, expansion, and success of mediation and arbitration is contingent upon the board encouraging railroads to use them when handling rate disputes. As a result of decades of efficiency improvements and recent but consistent rate increases, the railroads are now earning approximately their cost of capital, as documented through the study by Christensen Associates. And there's no doubt that the rail industry today is in far better financial health than it was in the immediate post-deregulation period. And it's in everyone's interest for railroads to earn sufficient returns on their investments to be able to maintain, improve, expand, and safely operate their extensive and expensive infrastructure and rolling stock. USDA realizes that gains in efficiency, improvements in service, and investments in infrastructure would not be possible without the financial success of the rail industry. Yet railroads are natural monopolies, and the rail transportation policy requires the board to maintain reasonable rates where there is an absence of effective competition. Producers with few transportation options, such as wheat farmers in remote areas, have the highest rates and bear the brunt of any rail service disruptions. Look no further than the rail service problems of 2014 to see numerous examples of grain and oilseed shippers who lacked competitive transportation options. As a result of inadequate competitive transportation options, those shippers faced skyrocketing costs, which in some areas widened the grain basis and depressed the net prices that farmers received. Ultimately, this lowered incomes as producers absorbed much of the increased transportation cost. USDA recognizes that policy changes should not reduce railroads' ability to invest in their networks or degrade service. Furthermore, USDA does not believe that every rate increase by a railroad is unreasonable or that railroads necessarily charge non-competitive rates to grain and oilseed shippers in general. The ability to charge such rates exists in non-competitive markets, however, and this warrants careful consideration of prescriptions by the board. This is why the rail transportation policy requires the board to maintain reasonable rates where there is an absence of effective competition, and why developing a workable rate challenge process for grain and oilseed shippers is so important. At its core, this proceeding is being held to establish a means for challenging rail rates for grain and oilseed shippers who have neither competitive transportation options nor access to regulatory relief. Once such processes are established, this objective of the rail transportation policy will have been met. Going forward, the task will be for the board to decide the merits of the rate challenges that are brought forth. And with that, I will end and say thanks again for allowing me to present the views of the U.S. Department of Agriculture here, and I thank you all for your interest on American agriculture.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us today. Mr. Tiller?
Thank you, Madam Chair. May it please the honorable members of the board. My name is Benjamin Tiller, and I'm here today representing the Montana Department of Agriculture. The department's mission fits squarely within the subject matter of EP 665, and we appreciate the board's recognition of these important issues to America's farmers. With me today is Mike O'Hara. He's a farmer from Fort Benton, Montana. He's a member of the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee, and he is the former chair of Montana's Rail Service Competition Council. I appreciate the board giving him the opportunity to speak today on short notice. I'd like to preface my comments with an assurance that the Montana Department of Agriculture is not here today as a rail critic. We appreciate the services that the railroads provide and understand their critical role in our ag economies. Positive communication between the Department of Agriculture and the Bnsf has increased considerably since the service collapse of 2013, and we commend them for those efforts. I will speak on 4 principal issues today. First, I will give an outline of Montana's rapidly changing ag economy. Next, I will discuss the difficulty Montana's small elevators face when negotiating rates and service with the railroads. Next, I will explain how not having an accessible appeal option directly affects the producers. Finally, I will offer the department's suggestions for meaningful changes. Montana produces 5.2 million metric tons of wheat per year, 75% of which is exported to foreign markets. Nearly all of that reaches the export terminals via rail. Recent shuttle facility development by private industry throughout the state has made it more efficient for the railroads to deliver this grain to port. Despite these efficiencies, however, we have not seen a decrease. We've only seen increases in shipping rates per bushel since the mid-2000s. The increasing cost of shipping grain in a system that is increasingly more efficient is concerning to the department. More concerning, however, is how substantial developing agricultural industries in our state are facing an ever-widening pricing differential. Montana last year became the #1 producer of pulse crops in the nation. Most people know pulse crops as chickpeas and lentils, but they also include various edible dry beans and peas. Since 2000, Montana's pulse acreage has more than doubled, and our data indicates that it's going to double again in the next 5 years. This rapid development means more productive farms and a greater abundance of highly nutritious food for the rest of the world. Unfortunately, as these crops gain marketability, shipping costs are quickly becoming a market deterrent. Smaller elevators that lack negotiating power handle most of the pulse crops in our state. This lack of negotiating power stems from the absence of a meaningful regulatory threat, and that's why we're here today. Pulse crop volumes might in the future justify shuttle shipments, but today's volumes don't support it. This is why the smaller facilities handling these crops continue to pay higher rates and suffer greater service problems than the larger, more established wheat trades. This hearing could not have been timelier. On May 1st, new Bnsf rail rates went into effect for the state of Montana. And the new rates will decrease the bottom line on Montana's farms in 3 concerning ways. First, Bnsf eliminated the differential between domestic and international shipments. The new rates are in excess of both the domestic rate, which was traditionally more expensive, and the international rate. To put it another way, shipping on the cheap route on May 1st this year was more expensive than shipping on the expensive route the day before. Second, Bnsf eliminated the fuel surcharge and incorporated that expense back into the tariff. The rates from Shelby to the PNW are roughly equal to what they were at this time last year. Unfortunately, the fuel surcharge on April 30th of 2014 was 38 cents per mile. On April 30th of 2015, it was 9 cents per mile. In essence, Bnsf has captured as profit what used to be a fuel expense and taken away the oversight the STB has over fuel surcharges. Montana's farmers are no longer receiving the benefit of $63 a barrel oil. Finally, and most concerning, is that the differential for less than shuttle rates, those cars that will carry the bulk of those pulse crops that I talked about at the beginning, have increased at a rate far greater than the larger shuttle shipments. This pricing differential is a market deterrent. Montana farmers should not be forced to grow wheat because the rail enjoys maximum efficiency to ship it. Smaller elevators should not be forced by unreasonable rates to bear the entire cost of expanding to shuttle operations before the industry can support the investment. The Bnsf will tell you that these rates are getting higher because moving smaller units is simply less efficient. If the increase of shuttle and non-shuttle rates was on the same trajectory, or there was some indication that the system as a whole was getting less efficient, then this argument might make sense. However, as private industry shuttle facility investment has continued to make the rail system more efficient as a whole, Bnsf's prices continue to go up. Increased efficiency in one area should not cause another area to become more inefficient. This is counter to the railroad's constant refrain that efficiency on the network is efficiency for all. This pricing differential and the disparate trajectories of the increases likely has less to do with efficiencies and more to do with carrier preference. It runs contrary to the railroad's common carrier obligations. The railroads often dismiss out of hand potentially cost-saving solutions from the industry. For example, even if various small shippers were to organize a 110-car train from various locations within our state, what the department has termed a reverse DEAT, or destination efficiency train, so in effect it's an origination efficiency train, the railroad won't offer the discounted DEAT rate. And we haven't received an explanation for why this train is less efficient to move than the reverse. Smaller shippers are discouraged by these rates, but they have no recourse. First, they fear retaliation. Our small elevators struggle weekly with inconsistent car deliveries. For example, they'll order 3 cars a week, yet consistently get 12 cars every 4 weeks. Is this because of crowding on the rail system, or is it because it just makes more economic sense for the railroad to deliver all of those cars at once? In any event, it is cheaper to deliver all of those cars at once, and those savings are profit to the rail. But rather than risk retaliation by challenging the service, these small elevators simply scramble to try and fill these cars, and they have to pay the demurrage while they're sitting there. Retaliation is a large and real fear for these smaller shippers. And second, they fear the cost of the rate case. We've heard it twice today. The STB estimates the 3 benchmark proceeding would take approximately 8 months and cost $500,000. A standalone cost case would cost more than $5 million. Small shippers can't take that risk when there's virtually no precedential guidance. But the small shippers aren't the ones suffering here. When faced with the risk of retaliation or the cost of a rate case, the common sense solution is to simply pass the cost off to the customer. Remember, their customer is the farmer, the Mike O'Hara's of the world. Large shippers face a similar conundrum. Are they meeting their duty to their shareholders if they choose to litigate over a rate that they could simply pass off to their customer? And the farmer has no power. He possesses a massive volume of a product with an expiration date. His market influence is limited to the next time his loan payment is due or the next time he needs somewhere to put his new crop. The department has some ideas to help solve these issues. At a very minimum, standing to bring the case must be granted to the real party in interest. I can think of no other judicial or quasi-judicial proceeding in which the entity that doesn't suffer the harm is the only entity that can bring a case. The farmer bears that cost of shipping and should have the chance to challenge those rates. Second, parties must be allowed to aggregate their claims to take advantage of economies of scale. Montana farmers move their grain from the same terminals on the same rails and are charged the same rates. When the real parties in interest can prove they are similarly situated, they should be able to bring an aggregated claim. This would increase efficiency for the board and protect the rail from constant piecemeal litigation. Then, state attorneys general should be allowed to bring cases on behalf of shippers and producers. This policy is sound because the state need not fear retaliation. It can act on behalf of others without regard to shareholder profits, and it has the resources and transportation expertise to effectively pursue a just remedy. And rate cases shouldn't be the only remedy available. Binding arbitration should be explored, and it is with Senate Bill 808. Others in this proceeding have suggested an arbitration system based on the NGFA model. This may be a good place to begin, but modifications are necessary. The NGFA calls for choosing 3 arbitrators from the industries in the dispute. What this means is that one industry in the dispute will always have a majority on that arbitration panel. We recommend the arbitration panel include a member of the STB board or a governmental magistrate, and we think that will work, especially if this board is expanded to 5 members. And then add to that panel 1 member from each of the industries. Second, appeals from the arbitration should be limited to those grounds in the Federal Arbitration Act and expanded to also include situations where the arbitrator's conclusions of law are clearly erroneous and where the findings of fact are not supported by substantial evidence. Without such limitations, arbitration will simply become an expensive first step in an even lengthier litigation process. Third, arbitration must be subject to time limits. An arbitration decision should be rendered within 6 months of the filing of the case, except in instances of extraordinary circumstances. Finally, the board should consider mandating arbitration for certain cases to bring the parties to the table. Obviously, this might require a legislative change, but it could serve as an effective deterrent to abusive pricing on smaller shipments. For the sake of discussion, and for the sake of discussion only, the rule could require aggregated claims with a value of less than $500,000 brought by fewer than 15 farmers to be subject to mandatory arbitration. If an arbitration mandate is considered, we would encourage further hearings to explore the appropriate jurisdictional limits. Others have supported final arbitration. We've heard that already today. And we're hesitant to join them because inevitably the railroad will always have more information. The shipper will be incented to request only a minimal concession for fear that the railroad's offer will receive deference because it owns the data and professes expertise on its own rail system. Montana's farmers are in an unenviable situation right now. Commodity prices are low, and they have no power to effectively negotiate or appeal the rail rates that are eating up a considerable portion of their margins. The Department of Agriculture is confident that today's conversations will provide the board with the information it needs to make meaningful changes. We believe that the solution begins with allowing producers to bring claims, since they're the ones bearing the cost of transportation, allowing parties to consolidate their claims to increase the efficiency of the process, and developing a binding arbitration system, mandatory in certain situations perhaps, where decisions are made by a balanced panel of arbitrators. You will hear later that Bnsf is investing $6 billion this year, and it spent $5.5 billion last year in capital investments. If these investments are working, why is the price to ship our smaller volume, yet very high potential and high value crops increasing at a faster rate than the increase on other commodities? Is it because their investments discriminate against these small shipments that fall within the common carrier obligation? Until there is a cost-efficient way to challenge these rates, there will be no way to know. And with that, I would like to turn over the remainder of my time to Mr. Mike O'Hara. Thank you.
My name is Mike O'Hara, and I would like to thank you for giving me time. My name is Mike O'Hara, and I would like to thank you for giving me time today for this testimony. My testimony will be specific to Montana grain growers and more specifically to our farm. My grandfather, Oliver O'Hara, arrived in Fort Benton, Montana in 1912 in a boxcar on the Great Northern Railroad with his life's possessions and the dream of making a life of homesteading. Today, my wife and I have a family partnership with our two sons in the same area that my grandfather homesteaded. Located in Choteau County, we are in the heart of the largest production area of quality milling wheat in Montana. Our farm has been predominantly raising wheat for the past 45 years. Until 5 years ago, we have diversified into oilseed, pulse crops, and malt barley because the profit margins had more potential. Our farm will be paying $150,000 freight on its 2015 wheat crop. The wheat production on our farm, that freight is to deliver it to the West Coast for export to our foreign customers. With the current price of wheat for this marketing year, we show a 70-cent bushel profit after our production costs. This is close to the break-even costs, reflecting an average crop year, not taking into account the risks of drought and other perils that agriculture face every day. The crops we have diversified to currently depend on single-car tariff rates. These new markets are being threatened as a result of the higher costs of transportation. All these costs are passed on to the farm, reflecting lower prices. As freight rates rise on the smaller shipments, how long will the profitability remain in these crops? How much time do we have until margins of these crops are as tight as wheat currently is? As we innovate into crops with more profit margin, those profits are being taken by higher freight rates. Thank you again for this opportunity to share our story, and the effects it has on our family farm depends on our livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Hara. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate that. Vice Chairman Begeman, you want to start the questioning?
Yes, Mr. Tiller. I'm sorry. No. Mr. Tiller, could you tell me whether, from your USDA or Montana ag perspective, what role has your agency had, or understanding do you have of the arbitration process that I believe is with Montana, certain Montana farm, some group in Montana has with Bnsf, and I'm sure that Mr. Miller later can be a little more specific from his perspective, but what your experience or your constituents' experience has been with that?
Yes, Madam Vice Chairman. So there is an arbitration agreement, a standing arbitration agreement between the Montana Grain Growers Association, Montana Farm Bureau Federation, and the Bnsf.
And is that a large group? I mean,
Yes,
associations
those are
are
two
large
of the largest
groups.
farm groups in the state of Montana, especially when it comes to wheat commodities. This arbitration agreement has been in place. Someone else will have to fill you in on the date, but it's only ever been used once, and it's only effective for negotiating wheat and barley rates. Bnsf has not agreed to negotiate these smaller rates that we discussed earlier today. It was used once in a rail case for shipping wheat from Shelby, Montana, which is the location I mentioned earlier today, to the PNW. But I believe that was nearly a decade ago. So it's to tell you what the perspective is, I think that the usage kind of answers that question. It's been used one time, and I'm not sure that that's because the rate is necessarily reasonable. I think it's because the process just doesn't work as well as one might hope.
Can you say more about why do you think there's only been one attempt at using it? Was that because the farmers and others who were interested just didn't think it was going to work for them? Has it been a reluctance on the part of the railroads to participate?
No, there's certainly not a reluctance, Madam Chairman, on the railroads to participate. I think the agreement is standing, and that if somebody wanted to arbitrate one of these rate cases, they could bring it. I think in the countryside there's some perception issues on how that's done, and I think that goes to Deputy Undersecretary Woodward's comments that any of these proceedings have to have, they have to be trusted by the constituents in order to be utilized. So.
Well, certainly to the I realize that's sort of outside of our purview. We have a job we need to do as well, but to the extent that private agreements or private resolutions can be achieved, I'm all for it. Every now and then, actually fairly frequently, we hear the comment that the board needs to clarify the standing for the growers or farmers. Can I ask why you think farmers don't think they have standing? I mean,
Madam Vice Chairman, I think our request is for clarification on that issue. If you look back at the federal court opinion in McCarty Farms, you will see that they do mention they are in fact suffering this this harm. However, I think that this concern about whether standing actually exists is more of a fear of having to litigate that issue at the beginning of a case. Because it isn't entirely settled precedent. And so that's going to be one of the very first dispository motions filed by your opponent in that case. And I think that's probably the deterrent there. And that's why some clarification would be helpful.
And if, since we kicked the hearing off with sort of a kind of putting the law aside, how best to accomplish I guess a fair process or a fair rate methodologies. Is arbitration your preference? What would your silver bullet be? And I'll really ask all three of you if you don't mind.
Madam Vice Chairman, I'm not sure if I could put my finger on what the department thinks the silver bullet is. I can tell you, I am a litigator, and when I look at the complexity of bringing a standalone cost case, I don't understand how even a large group of farmers with a very large case would be able to find the representation that they actually needed, especially considering you're breaking new ground and there is no precedent. So as a trial lawyer, you would look at that and say, well, yeah, I think you're probably right. I think the damages are there. But can you make that determination as to whether or not you're actually going to have a chance to succeed? I mean, there's just no precedent, and so you don't know. I'm not sure what the silver bullet is. I think that there probably is no silver bullet, but what we need is some sort of access. We need something that the people who are harmed by these rates can actually understand, and that they can actually get fair representation on. I think arbitration is a good place to begin because it is more informal. It doesn't require litigators to learn an entire new area of law and procedure, and they can get in there and make their cases in a much more informal setting. And I think that's what's beneficial about arbitration moving forward. So.
Maybe I'll just say that for reasons of protocol and practicality, USDA is not in a position at this point to really offer specific statutory fixes that might alleviate the situation from a shipper's standpoint, but I think we'd be happy to comment on any proposals that come forward at the STB's request. Thank you.
Well, from the farmer's perspective, I think arbitration has a lot of potential because of the system we've had now is economically infeasible for us to bring cases before you. So this could be a huge improvement and some place where we can have a voice on what's going on in our freight rates. So thank you.
Mr. O'Hara, have you testified in Washington before?
Have I testified before? No.
And well, thank you for the effort that you made to come here. As many folks have heard me say, and they're tired of it, but I'm a farmer's daughter. I certainly know that. I mean, while it's not the first thing that farmers do is to come to Washington to try to get help, and really, they usually just complain. Rightly so, perhaps. But I mean, they have other things to do than to come and make their case here. So thank you for the effort that you made.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mr. Tiller, I'm curious, you made the point when you were talking about, one of the things that's frustrating is that even though private investments being made in shuttle services and other things that should be making the cost more, making the system more efficient, therefore lowering the cost, you're not seeing that. And you made the comment that there's been a price increase for grain. I'm not sure if it was wheat or basically, the various pulse crops as well, that's outpacing other commodities. And I'm curious, are you all tracking that, and sort of what's the basis for concluding that grain the price rate is going up faster than it is for other commodities?
Madam Chairman, thank you for the question. We do track that, and Montana Wheat and Barley Committee hires Terry Whiteside, who has considerable past data on those rates. This one was easy because we had April 30 rates in our possession, and then we had the May 1st rates, which were published and announced 20 days prior. And so what we did is we compared. We said, what is the percentage increase on these shuttle shipments of grain? And I can't cite the percentages, but then we compared that to what is the percentage increase of these smaller shipments, and it went up higher. It went up faster. And so when you graph this out, that you'll see that there is a steeper increase on these smaller shipments. And remember, these smaller crops have a higher market price on average. You're looking at and Mr. O'Hara will correct me if I'm wrong. We're averaging $5 for wheat roughly, and you can sell chickpeas for $22 a bushel, thereabouts. Correct me.
Well, this year it's 18, but it's still profitable.
Right, and so you see, you have that more valuable commodity, and you see that steeper increase filling in that space there. And so, as Mr. O'Hara said earlier today, when does that margin become so as small as the margin is for wheat?
Okay, so I just want to be sure I'm understanding. What you're saying is that the rate for those carload pulse crops is going up more rapidly than the shuttle.
That is absolutely correct, Madam Chair.
But the carload pulse crops are likely more expensive to transport than the shuttle services, aren't they?
They certainly are, but our question is, are they getting less efficient? And so as the system increases in its efficiency because of these shuttle shipments, the system as a whole should be more efficient. And so when you see these price increases going up, there's no real justification for why it should go up more for these pulse crops than the larger shipments. Why should it go up at a faster clip?
You're saying that system's more efficient as well, but you're not seeing the benefit of the efficiency playing out in the rate.
That's correct, Madam Chairman. We have not seen an explanation as to why that rate should be going up at a faster rate.
And I thought also you had said when you were kind of going through your example that the domestic grain, did you say it was less expensive? and that it flipped?
Madam Chair, what happened is domestic grain was usually more expensive because once it got to the P&W, it had to go somewhere else.
Right.
So there's the operational costs of exploding that train. So that was traditionally more expensive. But no, what we're seeing there is, so we had those two different rates. When the new rates came out, those base tariffs were actually higher than both the cheap rate from April 30th and the expensive rate from April 30th. And so they basically, leapfrogged. And so we now have the most expensive rate, which is the rate that we're stuck with now. And so a producer cannot make the decision anymore. Well, it is cheaper for me to find an international market than a domestic market that's the same either way. And so they've lost that kind of market advantage that they had prior to April 30th.
I see. One of the things I'm curious about is going back to the issue of arbitration. When you all talk about arbitration, does that invariably, when you say that, mean binding arbitration? I mean, is it your view for arbitration to be effective, it has to be a binding arbitration?
Madam Chair, it does. Otherwise, like I said, it becomes just the first step in an even lengthier litigation process. And I think that it would be beneficial, too, if those decisions, although they don't have precedential value, they do have informative value. I mean, we have non-side opinions from the federal courts all the time, and those non-side opinions, they still inform us as litigators as to what the likely outcome is. And so I think you heard earlier today the professor mentioned that the coal cases, those are almost all under contract now because they have some certainty from the coal cases that existed at the beginning of this type of regulation. And so I think you would see that same kind of effect if those arbitration results were made public with obviously trade secret information redacted. So.
Deputy Secretary Woodward, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say that USDA does feel that it should be binding, but of course the devil's in the details.
Did you want to ask a follow-up?
Do you mind if I ask another question? Mr. Tiller, back to the arbitration program that does exist between BNSF and the two Montana associations with respect to, I think what you said, with wheat growers, essentially. Of all of, I guess, of the world of farm products grown in Montana, what percentage of your industry then does actually have access to this arbitration program? I mean, 10%, 2%, 80%? I'm just curious, who's left out?
Madam Vice Chair, and I know Mr. O'Hara will get into what percentages on his farm are represented by the different commodities. He can provide that to you. Wheat is the number one commodity in the state of Montana.
It is, okay.
Yes, and so most farmers at least at some point include wheat in their crop rotation. I can safely say, without quoting an exact percentage, that the vast majority of Montana farmers are putting wheat in the ground at some point during their rotation. And if you'd like, Mr. O'Hara probably has more detailed information.
Okay. And just is it the associations that have to arbitrate, or is it the actual grower that has the opportunity to arbitrate?
Do you know the answer to that question?
You can answer it for the record if you don't know. And I think that
I
when
know
BN
that-
is here, they can answer as well.
Yes, and I know that Kevin Kaufman's here as well, and he can answer that.
He's no longer with BNSF, I don't think. But,
No, he is not, but he is here. So.
but he does have a wealth of information. I know that.
Yes.
Mr. O'Hara.
Specifically to the arbitration that's been used once, and I'm sure Kevin will correct me if I'm wrong when he has a chance, is I think it was on one specific freight rate from Shelby, Montana to the Pacific Northwest. Percentage of our wheat that goes to there is 0. So percentage of the wheat that would be affected by that freight rate from Shelby to, I couldn't answer that question because it was specifically to that point of origin. So, but it'd be not a large percentage of the wheat in the state of Montana.
Thank you.
Mr. Tiller, I have one final question. Just the nature of grain and the multiple origination points, in many ways destination points, make it understandable why there don't tend to be a lot of contract movements. But I'm wondering, is that something you all have tried to create, opportunities to get contracts for movements that more commonly have gone under tariffs? Is that even an opportunity for your farmers?
Well, Madam Chairman, obviously, and I'm not sure I completely understand your question. Many farmers do contract with a purchaser at the beginning of the season.
I'm thinking with the railroad.
When it comes to the railroad, you will see that our larger elevators, like the Columbia Grains of the world, they are contracting rates. However, it's the smaller elevators who are paying the tariff and are sometimes, left with purchasing freight on the secondary market when they need it, which is an added cost. So no, it's not. They are not getting the benefit of contracted rates, and it's private too. Again, back to the coal example, you don't know what a good rate is. What are other people negotiating? It's until you have that precedent, until the STB has come out and said these are the rates. This is how we determined this. I mean, that's really the motivating factor. That's the influence that gets the BN to the table to say, yeah, let's put this under contract because it's fair.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for being here. And again, Mr. O'Hara, thank you for coming in. We really do appreciate it. It's very helpful.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So panel number 3, which is the Association of American Railroads, if you could start making your way to the front. Everybody ready? So we have Timothy Stratford, Counsel to the AAR, and John T. Gray, Senior Vice President for Policy and Economics. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here. Mr. Stratford.
Good morning, Chairman Miller, Vice Chairman Megaman. My name is Tim Stratford. I'm here today on behalf of the Association of American Railroads. I'm joined by my colleague John Gray, Senior Vice President for Economics and Policy at the AAR. This morning, I will provide a brief overview of the AAR's comments in this proceeding and try to put this proceeding into historical context of the agency's previous attempts to craft rate reasonableness standards consistent with its statutory responsibilities. Mr. Gray will then briefly discuss the economic environment in which railroads transport grain products, the economic underpinnings of sound rail rate regulation, and flaws in proposals made by shipper interests in this proceeding. We'd be happy to answer any questions the Board may have at the conclusion of our testimony. The Board began this proceeding with the stated goal of ensuring that its rate reasonableness process is accessible for railroad customers that ship or receive grain. There's a fundamental difference between ensuring that process is available and proposals by shipper interests in this proceeding that would seek rate prescriptions based on economically suspect revenue to variable cost ratios and generic formulas. There's no basis in this record or any other for the Board to conclude that the transportation of grain should be subject to unique rate reasonableness rules. The AAR submits the Board's processes are accessible to railroad customers and other stakeholders, and that recent efforts by the Board have made them more so. Through its Rail Customer and Public Assistance Program, the Board makes its staff available to answer inquiries about its processes and engage in informal mediation efforts. Where formal rate relief has been sought, the Board has established 2 forms of simplified rate cases, and in the 4 cases decided under its simplest 3 benchmark process has rendered decisions within 9 months. Mandatory mediation is part of all rate complaint proceedings. In response to calls from shipper groups, the Board has lowered its filing fees for complaints down to $350, well below levels otherwise consistent with its user fee policy. Also in response to requests by shippers, the Board recently increased the limits on relief on simplified cases by eliminating the limit on simplified SAC and nearly quadrupling the limit on 3 benchmark cases. Some shipper comments in this proceeding and some of the Board's questions in the notice scheduling this hearing refer to the concept of revenue adequacy. For the purposes of today's hearings, there are no unique aspects of grain transportation that require special consideration of revenue adequacy in this proceeding. The Board has already compiled a separate record in Ex Parte 722 and scheduled a 2-day hearing for next month. The AAR intends to participate in that hearing and provide expert testimony on issues related to revenue adequacy. My colleague, Mr. Gray, will speak to some of the economic principles underlying sound rail rate regulation and some of the problems in shipper proposals in this record. that would rely on unrestricted rate comparisons. Before he does, I'd like to briefly note some of the historical struggles the agency has confronted in judging the reasonableness of rail rates and consider some of those efforts that the courts have judged to be arbitrary and capricious. This history helps illustrate the legal standards that would apply to efforts to craft special rate reasonableness rules for grain traffic. Prior to the legislative reforms of the 1970s, the ICC prescribed rates using its traditional pre-reform criteria: rate comparisons with other similar movements, analysis of economic impacts to the community, and a determination of the railroad's fully allocated costs of moving traffic. This, along with other regulatory constraints, contributed to a railroad industry in severe financial distress. By 1978, the agency recognized the rate comparisons were of limited value, and the agency began the long effort to determine rate guidelines that would be consistent with sound economics, the 3 and 4R Acts, and later the Staggers Act, which culminated in the 1985 Coal Rate Guidelines decision. During that process, the ICC struggled to find an appropriate way to allow for the necessary differential pricing for a healthy rail system that could invest to meet customer demand. The agency recognized the need for pricing above fully allocated cost levels and tried to apply a 7% additive to attempt to reflect differential pricing. The courts rejected this so-called 7% solution as arbitrary and capricious. The agency also considered judging rates based on a ton-to-ton-mile ratio, but later recognized that such an approach did not reflect customer demand for service. Coal rate guidelines recognized the need for differential pricing in railroad rate making and the need for the agency's rate reasonableness standards to reflect demand characteristics. The standalone cost standard was implemented to reflect such principles and to ensure that where a railroad has market dominance, a complaining shipper is not required to subsidize parts of the network it does not use or pay for inefficiencies. But as the board well knows, the SAC standard can be time-consuming, complex, and expensive. This is not necessarily surprising, as railroads are networks moving a mix of competitive and captive traffic in different service and different equipment. And railroad rate disputes can be complex litigation with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. Comparable litigation in the federal courts is time-consuming and complex as well. The AAR has long stated its desire to work with the agency to streamline the SAC process where possible. Railroads do not like spending money on lawyers and consultants any more than shippers do. But the proposals by shipper interests in this proceeding are not aimed at improving the board's processes, but instead are RVC tests untethered from economic theory and unconstrained by any limits on relief. Previous attempts to avoid the economic analysis of market demand and cross-subsidy by applying such tests have been overturned by the courts. In McCarty Farms, the ICC tried to shortcut an economic analysis of the rates at issue and instead looked at whether the RVC ratios generated by those rates were higher than those of the comparison benchmark traffic. The Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit found that the ICC's approach and explanation lacked, quote, supporting principle or intellectual coherence, and the agency, quote, had not intelligibly explained why the trade-off chosen was reasonable. The court concluded that RVC comparisons cannot pass for reasoned decision-making, and the court remanded the case to the ICC. Mr. Gray will address the limited value and economic meaning of RVC ratios. I just note in closing that the only instance where RVC ratio comparisons have withstood judicial scrutiny in the last 35 years has been their use in the 3 benchmark test, where they have been allowed in cases of limited value in response to direct congressional authorization for the agency to develop simplified methodologies for small value cases. But the agency and the courts have explicitly recognized that the 3 benchmark test is crude and imprecise, and the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit has observed that the 3 benchmark process does not facilitate a search for truth, and, quote, there is good reason to believe that judgments rendered pursuant to the 3 benchmark framework more often than not will be the antithesis of mathematical certainty. The only justification for the use of RVC comparisons at all has been their limited application through limits on relief in small cases. The board has only justified their use by stating that most rates are set according to market forces, and most regulated rates should be subject to the SAC test. With that, I'll turn things over to John.
Thanks, Tim. I'm John Gray. I'm Senior Vice President for Policy and Economics at AAR, and today I'd like to put the discussion on the grain rate issues into a bit of economic context. First, to quickly overview the rail system. Today, railroads account for about 40% of our nation's intercity freight ton miles and serve nearly every agricultural, industrial, wholesale, retail, resource-based sector in our economy, including both grain and grain-related products. In 2014, U.S. Class I railroads originated almost 1.5 million carloads of grain, which translates into almost 140 million tons of grain. While significant, grain represents only 4.9% of total carloads and 7.6% of total tonnage for the rail system as a whole. The United States is the world's top grain producer, with average U.S. grain production from 2005 to 2014 of 533 million tons. But what crops are grown, where, and in what quantities, and how and when they are transported is determined by a complex interaction of international and other market forces. The variety of forces that impact grain production and consumption make it clear that generalized conclusions about grain are exceedingly problematic. Simply put, there is no homogeneous grain market in the United States or anywhere else in the world. As illustrated in AAR's written testimony, various types of grains and grades of grain have unique characteristics and are also marked by unique market volatility. And like U.S. grain production generally, U.S. grain exports also fluctuate sharply because they are a function of many complex market, regulatory, and geopolitical factors. American grain shippers benefit from strong competition among railroads, trucks, and barges. According to 2011 USDA data, the most recent available, the truck share of total U.S. grains transported was almost 60%, when compared with just 28% for railroads and 12% for barges. The fact that the truck share of tons has been rising for several years, it was only 50% in 2006, is strong evidence of the market and of the intensity of the competition that railroads face if they wish to participate in grain markets. There is no escaping the reality that absent government subsidies, shippers, including grain shippers, must pay for rail services they demand. Growth in this demand will provide the incentive for railroads to make the investments needed to increase the capacity in their networks, but only if freight rates are allowed to reflect the true marketplace. In recent years, railroads have been putting more money back into their networks than ever before. From 1980 through 2014, they spent $575 billion of their own funds on renewal, maintenance, and expansion of their infrastructure and equipment. Even so, much remains to be done. For this reason, expenditures have rapidly accelerated during the last 7 years, with almost $165 billion spent during this period. An additional $29 billion in spending is planned for 2015. Recently, in a public hearing and in written comments to the board, it was suggested that railroads need to invest more in capacity to alleviate the service issues that occurred in parts of the country. We agree. However, we must always remember that the railroad's ability to commit massive funding to their network is entirely dependent on financial performance that produces the necessary cash flow and returns on investment. There is no question that the majority of rail rates, including rail rates for transporting grain, are driven by competition, including competition between railroads, other modes of transportation, and by product and geographic competition, both at home and overseas. This competition has resulted in grain rates as measured by revenue per ton mile being 29% lower on an inflation-adjusted basis in 2013 versus 1981. The same measure is also lower for major individual types of grain as well. Moreover, according to USDA data from 2000 to 2013, the last year again that is available, average prices that farmers paid for most of their supplies rose much faster than the rail rates to move their grain. Some movements of grain are governed by rail transportation contracts. Additionally, over 60% moves on common carrier tariff rates, generating revenues to variable cost ratios below 180%. Thus, the potential universe for rate complaints by grain shippers is relatively small. For those limited instances where the board is authorized by statute to regulate rates, economically sound regulations should seek to simulate competitive outcomes rather than artificially constrain railroad rates below competitive market levels. So what do the economics of rail regulation and operation tell us about what should the outcomes of sound regulation should be? First, because economies of density exist in the railroad industry, that is, that the unit cost of transportation declines as traffic volume increases, marginal costs are almost always lower than average costs. In other words, the cost to a railroad of handling an additional unit of traffic is usually less than the average cost of handling each unit of traffic. Because of high fixed costs associated with track, facilities, and equipment, and the need for railroads to cover their risk-adjusted capital costs, railroads cannot price all their traffic at marginal cost or even an average variable cost and still cover their total cost. Any firm that cannot cover all its costs ultimately cannot survive. Neither can railroads price on the basis of average costs. Because of competition, much rail traffic moves at rates below average cost and above marginal cost. Any traffic moving at rates above marginal cost makes at least some contribution to the fixed cost, and everyone is therefore better off than they would be if that traffic were not moving at all. If the rates on traffic were raised on to the average total cost, much of this traffic would be diverted to other modes and would simply not move at all, and that traffic's contribution to fixed cost would be lost. If this happens, railroads would lose revenue and they would have had otherwise. Either the revenue would have to be made up through other rail customers, or the railroads would have to reduce costs, perhaps by reducing employment, service offerings, cutting reinvestments, or eliminating infrastructure, or by some other means. For a sustainable rail system, it is absolutely necessary to price services differentially, based on demand, in order to allow the possibility of recovering their variable cost, plus their fixed cost, plus the risk-adjusted cost of capital. Without differential pricing, the rail industry could not have achieved its tremendous gains in operating efficiency and the financial health, which in turn have allowed the railroads to make their massive investments in the networks and to accommodate their customers' needs. This rate regulation principle, implemented by the ICC and the board following the Staggers Act, was not a temporary remedy to address the financial state of the industry. Rather, demand-based differential pricing was a structural reform reflecting fundamental railroad economics. Now I'd like to address some very specific issues in this proceeding. The proposals made by shipper groups for grain-specific reasonableness rates should be rejected. Simply put, the economics of rail transportation do not change based upon the commodities in the rail car. When shipper groups, including grain shippers, complain about the standalone cost tests or other board methodologies, they often simply don't like the result produced by sound economics. For example, when the groups that represent grain shippers talk about the Sac Test being unworkable for shippers on light-density lines, what they frequently are saying is that a Sac analysis will show that rates are not unreasonable. When they say that varied destinations of grain traffic make race case analysis difficult, the board should consider whether a grain complaint would be significantly more complex than chemical cases, which incidentally may involve hundreds of origin-destination pairs, that it is already considering. When grain shippers say diverse origin-destination lanes make rate prescriptions undesirable, the board should consider how or if the proposals that they have put forward will solve that problem. Let's look at a few of the details. First, the board should not make specific adjustments to IRCs without making holistic changes to the costing system. The Alliance for Rail Competition proposed that the board develop a grain cost adjustment factor because it believes that the uniform rail costing system overstates the variable cost associated with grain shipments. ARC points to the fact that IRCs understates the cost of certain shipments, such as the shipment of hazardous materials, and concludes that IRCs must therefore overstate the cost of other non-hazardous materials. The AAR has stated in other proceedings that IRCs does understate hazardous material risk costs because, as Dr. Schmalensi noted earlier this morning, they're not even included in IRCs, since they are not even reported in the R1 report on which IRCs is based. Thus, in terms of IRCs, the costs ARC is trying to redistribute are really phantom dollars. In fact, the extensive use of system-wide average costs throughout the regulatory regime strongly counsels against piecemeal adjustments or favoring shippers of the 1.5 million carloads of grain versus the shippers of 15 million carloads of other commodities and 13 million intermodal units. The effect of such approach would be to lower the IRC's calculation of variable costs for grain shipments, presumably with the intent to artificially increase the proportion of grain traffic subject to the board's jurisdiction. However, since IRCs is a closed system, the board would need to decide which other lines of traffic should absorb the increases of cost. Thus, the board would ultimately be set in the position of having to artificially select winners and losers on this issue. Second, both NGFA and ARC offer up variants of the board's 3 benchmark test and ask the board to use unrestricted RVC comparisons. NGFA's Ag Commodity Maximum Rate methodology takes the already crude and inappropriately used average RVC ratios for a group of comparable traffic and reduces that analysis into a formula. ARC advocates for a two-benchmark test that ignores comparable traffic and therefore even the minimal primitive analysis of rail markets already embedded in the three-benchmark method. It is worth remembering why a comparison of RVC ratios tells you almost nothing about market demand. Economists think about demand elasticity in price terms by looking at markup over long-run marginal costs. But IRC's variable costs are not marginal costs, have no uniform relationship to marginal costs, and can never be adjusted to even approximate the direction of marginal cost. In reality, all an RVC ratio tells you is something about the value of a particular line of business to the provider of that service. It says nothing about whether the price in that which is appropriate in the market. In the real world, two movements with the same RVC ratio can have very different demand characteristics and reflect very different market conditions. While such a crude tool may be minimally acceptable for simplified cases with limits on relief, it lacks any sort of economic justification as a method for judging all grain rates. To make matters worse, both NGFA and ARC seek to have comparisons of challenge rates to RVC ratios on railroads other than those handling the movement in question. The board should reject these calls on the same ground that is done in its simplified standards decision. Comparisons of RVC ratios of different carriers defeat the very purpose of trying to determine the appropriate contribution to joint and common costs that the complaining shipper should be making. The board correctly concluded that, quote, the RVC ratio of potentially captive traffic of one carrier provides no useful information concerning the appropriate contribution to fixed and common costs of another carrier. Third, as part of its formula, NGFA would have the board compare RVC ratios of a challenge rate to an average RVC ratio that includes movements that are less than 180%. In simplified standards, the board also concluded that comparison groups should consist of only traffic moving in RVC ratios in excess of 180% in order to judge the amount of contribution to joint and common costs that the complaining shipper should be responsible for. The board noted that, quote, the rates available to traffic with competitive alternatives would provide little evidence on the degree of permissible demand-based differential pricing needed to provide a reasonable return on investment. In short, ARC and NGFA would have the board take the worst possible measurement tool available, the RVC ratio, and use it as broadly and as inappropriately as possible. Finally, I would like to address the appropriateness of using RSAM as a rate reasonableness tool. RSAM suffers from several infirmities. First, the board's annual revenue adequacy calculation dramatically understates the railroad net investment base and therefore overstates return on investment. Second, any use of averages presents a ratcheting problem. As RVCs above the average are moved down by regulation, the corresponding average moves down as well. Third, use of such an average fails to recognize that some movements with higher demand are appropriately priced above the average reflected in the RSAM. Fourth, the use of the RSAM as a rate-making tool would force rates below competitive levels and does not allow for the analysis of customer demand. Finally and critically, RSAM is just another form of an RVC ratio, suffering from all the same frailties and limitations as a market measurement tool as do all other RVC ratios. In conclusion, I would ask that the board continue to rely on sound economics and its established processes as a basis for judging the reasonableness of all rail rates, including grain rates.
Thank you both very much. This is perhaps not fair because I know you only heard this morning from Dr. Schmalensi, but as you were talking about RSAM and RVC being very crude, I'm just wondering how much his description of IRCs being flawed and really unfixable resonated with you, and if you'd care to comment on that as an economist.
I would comment that I fully agree that IRCs is flawed. It's very flawed. And as I discussed with him actually before the meeting, I disagree with him on the fact that it is unfixable, but it is not fixable in the form in which it exists today. It would take an enormous amount of work, probably almost as long as it would take to change the statutes around it, to create the type of modeling that would be able to properly reflect density in the rail system, that would be able to deal with the location-specific issues around the rail system. Take a tremendous amount of additional data to do that. So I'm not sure that the fix is practical, but I disagree that with enough money that it couldn't be done.
One of the things I'm curious about is the issue of arbitration that was raised by the folks from Montana, and they're interested in seeing more things arbitrated. Again, it was an interesting theme that you saw in Dr. Schmalensi's presentation when you look at the use of SAC and the complications of that process versus arbitration. What's your reaction to the viability of more arbitration?
Well, you know, I reflect one of Tim's comments in his testimony that railroads are not great fans of the money that is spent on rate cases in terms of the legal fees or the consultant fees. In fact, they probably end up spending more money than the shipper community does. So a methodology that permits some acceleration of the process is attractive to us. What we object to is not arbitration per se. It is what I would call compulsory arbitration. We feel that arbitration, if it is going to exist, needs to be voluntary between the parties. Otherwise, it's unlikely to lead to a really satisfactory solution.
You know, we have the opportunity of arbitration now, though, and it seems that it's rarely utilized. So when left to the choice of the parties, it seems like the parties are rarely willing to choose it. Is that a misperception?
I can't argue with the fact that it has been very rarely used, and apparently, as you say, when left to the discretion of the two parties involved, that it is infrequently used. I know that at least one of our members has offered from the beginning to participate in arbitration. I don't believe they've had any takers. Any takers.
Mm-hmm. It's true. And then one other question before I give the Vice Chairman a chance to get in here. But going back to the issue of grain rates, reflecting on the testimony that we heard from the Montana Department of Transportation from Mr. Tiller, looking back to the GAO study that was done nearly 10 years ago now that talked about the fact that grain rates were trending higher than other commodity rates. I don't know if a renewal of the GAO study would say the same thing today, but certainly we had that evidence at that time, and what we were hearing today from the Department of Agriculture and the Montana Department of Agriculture is that grain rates tend to be trending higher than other commodities. Again, is that a misperception? Is that a fact? Why would grain rates tend to go up higher and faster?
Well, first of all, I had not looked at that specific issue in preparation for this. We looked at the grain rates within themselves, and noted that yes, for a long time they trended lower, and for the last few years, the revenue per revenue ton mile measurement that we have, since we don't have access to the actual rates, has moved higher. Now, you know, is it something that is unusual? I think on that, or is there a reason behind Is there a reason behind it? I think on that is probably at best when you have the panel of the railroads later this afternoon, to ask them about that, because these things tend to be very individual. They're focused on the individual market that a particular railroad is engaged in. And there are probably instances in which, significant instances in which grain rates have not trended higher at a faster rate? I don't know. But that is something that the individual railroads would be much better equipped to answer than
Okay.
our organization.
You want to jump in, Ann?
Yeah, I won't take too much of your time. I certainly appreciate your representing, a wide group of membership, and that can be kind of difficult. So I'm not going to put you on the spot as much as I might want to. I'm not. Is your message that the status quo, although the fact that the 3B case is so perhaps inaccurate, but the status quo is sufficient from your industry's perspective with respect to rate cases?
I think that we are always open to improvements in process. What concerns us is not improvements in the process which make it more efficient, make it better for both parties, quite frankly, if it is. What concerns us is that is taking what is already a rather delicate item like the 3B methodology in terms of its economic validity and pushing it even further away from sound economics. We are always willing to look at other types of proposals, but again, our emphasis is that whatever those proposals are and however they're developed, the ability to reflect economics that is as sound as possible is really important. We think that the SAC method, obviously, it is something, as Dr. Schmalensi indicated this morning, was adapted from other network industries. And we think that while it is being used somewhat differently in this context and in the regulatory context that the STB uses, that it does represent a concept which has some economic validity behind it for looking at the range in which reasonable rates might fall. It does not necessarily get to the fairness issue that he was describing, but it does get to a reasonableness issue in terms of the market for those rates. Likewise, the simplified SAC method retains most of those characteristics while simplifying the application dramatically. But again, the concept is process whatever can be done to improve that. We're interested in. Straying too far from economic foundations, no, that's something that is not where we'd like to go. Our problem with the proposals that are in front of you is, as I said, they take basically a very frail system, in which the 3B methodology is economically, and push it further away from economics.
Well, I will say that, with the proceeding, we really invited any and all parties, including AAR and industry, to offer ideas and put something else on the table so that we could develop, establish a process, a meaningful, workable process that I don't believe we have necessarily fulfilled yet. And that is still on the table. I am open to any and all ideas within the law that we can. I'm open to some ideas that were not in the law either, but I know that that would be revealed quite quickly if I tried to go after that. One of the things that your boss mentioned during the House T&I hearing in May was speed and accuracy, and I can assure you, and I think I'll talk for Deb with that. That's our goal as well. We certainly aren't looking to have just sort of a made up whatever it takes to get a case in and out, but we would like accuracy as well. So I'm just going to state really for all the parties, all the stakeholders, whether you're here or listening, I stay open-minded to ideas, creative ideas. I mean, maybe even like a negotiated rulemaking where for several parties could come together of different views and see if there is something that folks could tentatively agree on or reluctantly agree on, just to try to move the process forward. But thank you for participating here today. Thanks, Tim.
So, John, I have a couple of other questions. You said this pretty clearly, I think, in your testimony, but I'd like to hear you say a bit more about it, and that's the proposal that I think came from NGFA, or perhaps it was ARC, but that the traffic pool could include other railroads.
Yes.
And you sort of rejected that idea, but I'm wondering whether, if you're talking about the Western railroads or the Eastern railroads, if you don't see enough of the same characteristics in terms of their operating environment, I'm just wondering why that isn't reasonable to use them in the comparison group.
I think that one of the real concerns, in large part on that, is that, first of all, as I said, it doesn't tell you a lot about whether those two carriers are in what would be comparable markets. Even if you're only making a regional comparison, you find that the railroads in the two regions, while they have some markets that are in common and can be identified in common, there are an awful lot of markets that are very different and have very different operating characteristics for them to serve those markets. It's not uncommon that you'll have one railroad that has very different route characteristics between an origin destination pair. Has very different means by which it has to provide the service between those locations, and thus will generate very, very different RBC ratios on what is essentially the same market. Even if they may have similar prices in that market, will generate very different RBC ratios from that market. It's kind of the reverse issue of what I said earlier, where you have some instances where movements that have very different characteristics will have the same RBC ratio. This is one of those cases where they may have the same very similar price characteristics because of the basic market they're in, but will generate very different RBC ratios. So identifying the details of that is, first of all, it's a huge job. It's something you'd have to do on a case-by-case basis to even identify whether you had similar moves. And when you get to the end of it, you don't really know much about whether these moves, even if you can identify them as somewhat similar, you don't know very much about whether they speak to the issue of what the contribution in that particular traffic should be to the fixed costs, given that that the railroads' business portfolios, the portfolio of the total business that they have, may be very different, and they may be in very different positions within a market than another carrier. So, first of all, it fails in terms of just the technical analysis, because the technical analysis cannot show you that you're going to get a similar result because of just the operating characteristics. It fails probably in terms of the market analysis, and it certainly fails in terms of the portfolio of business type of analysis.
It seems like, and really as near as I can tell, in some ways, whether it's shippers looking at various processes or the railroads, you hear some of the same things. Everybody's interested in simplified processes so we can go faster and it can be cheaper. But when you start talking about a simplified process, then depending on, who thinks it's disadvantageous to them, they find inaccuracies in that process that then argues that it's not going to be a useful process. I'm just wondering if you have proposals or approaches that would allow us to simplify and speed up our processes while retaining sufficient detail to be reasonably accurate.
Certainly any process which speeds up anything and simplifies anything almost inevitably results in compromise.
Right.
And it results in compromise not just of the parties that might be participating in it, but it results in compromise of the technical accuracy, and it results in compromise in the ability to use all available information in the process. So putting together what is a simplified process, I guess we could cynically say we're glad it's your job and not ours on this. But the reality is that the board has been working on trying to develop the simplified processes so that they have some, at least some reasonable grounding in economics for 10 years now, and it hasn't proven to be a very fruitful or productive process for you. I applaud you for the effort that you've made in trying to negotiate through this minefield, but it is a minefield, and I think that we can say that that improving the process should be a goal, but it is something that is unlikely to satisfy all parties. No matter what the proposal is. I think it is, as evidenced by the difficult time that you've had for 10 years working on this project, I think it's going to be very difficult to move forward. And while I wish I had some ideas that could help with it, unfortunately, any ideas that I have that would make the process simpler would also unconditionally compromise the validity of the results that you would get, and that I think that's a lot of the concern that you're running into.
One final question, and I'm not sure if I understood correctly. As you were going through your testimony, and you were talking about the fact that the RVC ratio really doesn't tell you anything about markets and marginal cost pricing, and what that is versus average price. But did I understand you to say that the marginal price is the best way to evaluate the market price, or did I misunderstand?
No. The economics says that in a perfectly competitive world, that the price that you would charge in a market would be equal to the total marginal cost. Some economic concept that's very, very difficult to actually put into reality, but it says that you would price at marginal cost. And what I was saying on that was that because of the issues of density that we have, where the marginal cost tends to get much lower, much quicker as you add volume to the network than does the average cost, or certainly the total cost. Effectively, you cannot sustain a railroad pricing at marginal cost. It just can't be done.
I said that was my final question, but actually I have one more question. Well, actually, I'll just leave it there for now. We'll come back to it maybe in July. Thank you both very much for being here, and we'll be interested in hearing what your member railroads have to say this afternoon. We can explore some of these issues in more detail. Thank you very much. I think we will plan to take our lunch break now. Okay, so I've been asked to remind you, which is the complicated issue around lunch, that security wants to be sure that you are aware that if you leave the building for your lunch break, Leave your luggage and bags in the hearing room, so none of those have to be rescreened again, because you will have to sign in again when you come in. So, to the extent you can, let's simplify that coming back into the building thing as much as possible. This may just be hopeful thinking, but we'll try to start again at 12:30 if at all possible. I know there are some difficulties because you're going to have to leave the building and get signed back in, and if that proves to be too aggressive, we'll certainly try to give people an opportunity to reconvene. And what's most important is that our panel 4 members are able to be back to the building. So if they're here and Ann and I are here, we'll get started. Otherwise, we'll wait for them to come back.